Many proclaimed that socialism was gone forever, but they were wrong.
Welcome. America will never be a socialist country.
Seriously, and you're just repeating dumb liberal talking points. Be a socialist. Be a radical. Open your mind. I'm serious. You're not a socialist. You're a...
What is it with politics in the United States? Why is our discourse so strange, so polarizing, so emotional? We seek solutions based on vague morals and ideals, freedom and democracy, instead of solutions based on analysis of fact and science. Deviation from this manufactured normalcy, the status quo, is treated as a threat to social order and our so-called way of life. Donald Trump sends out campaign emails warning of the threat from the socialist Democrats. When scientists say our emissions and various sources of pollution are killing our environment, armchair scientists decry them as a hoax. When medical experts call for measures to halt the spread of a new disease, we see people out on the streets, armed with their degree from Google U, proclaiming it's just a flu. Conspiracy theories and convoluted plots take the place of class analysis. There's always a hidden agenda behind everything, it seems. This mentality goes back to the Cold War, as the supposed threat of communism infected almost every aspect of public life. Propaganda was everywhere, warning of the supposed impending takeover. Could your neighbor be a Russian spy? People lost their jobs, their livelihoods, their freedom sometimes, in a campaign now known as the Red Scare. People like McCarthy and Palmer constantly warned of an infiltration that never materialized. But the Cold War is over, right? Why does the Red Scare stand out among U.S. propaganda campaigns? And why was it so effective at shaping and driving political discussion in this country, even today? Well, it's a bit of a long story, but everything starts to make sense once you get into it. The precursor to the first Red Scare was the preparedness movement prior to World War I. Prompted primarily by the sinking of the Lusitania by German U-boats in 1915, and emboldened by years of mistrust directed at immigrant communities, the goals of the preparedness movement were to overcome the trend of isolationism that had dominated U.S. politics, and to solidify the concept of loyalty to the United States in the public mind. On the surface, this was presented as measures to prepare the United States for an inevitable German attack. As industries geared up for war, the political front called on new measures to stamp out this supposed disloyalty and mobilize the people to support the Entente's war effort. Even Woodrow Wilson, who won election and re-election on a no-war platform, supported preparedness against the growing German threat. There are citizens of the United States, born under other flags, who have poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life. We are without adequate federal laws to deal with it. Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out. These so-called disloyal creatures, German Americans in particular, were accused of plots to sabotage the war industry. As the communist movement continued to oppose the war effort, labor leaders were often accused of having foreign ties, and opponents of conscription were portrayed as direct threats to America's defense. The IWW itself was directly accused of being funded by the German government. Wilson and other capitalists attempted to foster a sense of reverence and loyalty to the United States, and in particular its flag. Are you going yourselves individually and collectively to see to it that no man is tolerated who does not do honor to that flag? The first Red Scare began at the end of World War I, in response to the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks came to power, promising an end to the devastating war, causing anger among the former allies of the Russian Empire for their so-called betrayal. U.S. propaganda agents fabricated Soviet documents to prove that Vladimir Lenin, and the rest of the Bolsheviks for that matter, were merely a client of the Kaiser in Germany. Communists would also be associated with anti-immigrant rhetoric of the time, and many immigrant working-class communities were targeted. The propaganda of this period mainly focused on the so-called anti-American nature of Bolshevik philosophy and the criminal actions of radical groups in the United States. The now infamous Palmer raid saw hundreds of radical activists rounded up and their offices ransacked by the Justice Department. Palmer famously predicted a Bolshevik uprising in the United States planned for May Day 1920. This never materialized, but Palmer and others would continue their predictions. Throughout this period, communists would be further scapegoated for violent crimes, plots of rebellion, and even race riots. Strikes were painted as attempts to bring Bolshevism to America. This rhetoric led to increased polarization between left and right, and political demonstrations often broke out into deadly violence. However, over time, it became difficult to maintain this campaign of fear. Between the constant warnings of communist plots and uprisings that just never happened, and a gradual decline in Socialist and Communist Party membership thanks to the Justice Department's raids, many Americans began to grow weary of these tactics. Additionally, the administration of Calvin Coolidge was encouraged by post-war economic growth and sought to distance itself from the corruption of the Harding administration. Coolidge would remove many of the officials responsible for these previous policies, including William Flynn, the director of the Bureau of Investigation. Although the federal policy of targeting communists directly was stifled somewhat by more progressive officials, the FBI's new director, J. Edgar Hoover, would continue his own quasi-Red Scare, working with state governments to repress communists and labor organizations. And even as American society became more accepting of social criticism, communists and socialists were still scapegoated for violent crimes. The trial of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, Italian-American anarchists arrested for murder, shows that the justice system still considered communism to be opposed to Americanism. There was little evidence for the crime whatsoever, and the presiding judge remarked that, even though they may not actually have committed the act, they are nevertheless culpable because they are the enemy of our existing institutions. The case was decried internationally, but the two were found guilty and executed in 1927. This practice of guilt by association and the direct labeling of communists as enemies would have likely continued in greater capacity, but other issues became a priority. The 1929 stock market crash and the ensuing Great Depression was an example of capitalism in extreme crisis. As people lost their jobs in record numbers, savings and investments vanished, and no clear way out, communist ideas were back on the rise. FDR's New Deal served as a way to save capitalism from this crisis, while co-opting some of the rhetoric and proposals of socialist groups. These policies would later be used as proof by some that the government had been infiltrated by communist forces, but the policies did their job effectively. As World War II broke out, and the U.S. found itself allied with the Soviet Union against the Nazis, anti-communism had to be put on hold. The wartime American propaganda machine even tried to support the Soviet war effort, with films and posters highlighting the Russian fight against fascism. This temporary alliance allowed for a post-war revision of the anti-communist narrative. As communism spread in newly liberated nations, the U.S. shifted its target back to the Soviet Union with its containment policy. The old methods and tactics would not be sufficient to resist the growing popularity of the communist movement domestically. The Second Red Scare would truly begin in 1947, when a new player entered the game and changed the rules forever. For much of American history, and even into the 20th century, Catholicism and its adherents were mistrusted by the majority Protestant U.S. population. As the prevalent faith among many immigrant populations in the mid to late 1800s, anti-Catholicism was strongly tied to xenophobic anti-immigrant rhetoric of the time. Catholics were seen by some as having dual loyalties to the Pope and the Vatican, and some religious leaders feared infiltration. Some of the earliest public schools were established by Catholics in response to this discrimination, as a means of isolating their youth from non-Catholic influence. This further fueled mistrust of Catholicism, as these parochial schools sought public funding. This sentiment would eventually subside for the most part, as the World War era fostered a greater sense of national unity, particularly among Christian groups. Catholic leaders would decry fascism and communism in their sermons and broadcasts, and some even warned of the infiltration of the government by these evil forces. When World War II ended, along with the temporary alliance with the Soviet Union, J. Edgar Hoover wanted to remind the public of the true threat to American society: communism. Although official state enforcement had cooled off, surveillance of communist groups had not stopped during this alliance, and by 1946, Hoover was ready to resume the old policies of the first Red Scare. But the assistant director, D. Milton Ladd, had an additional proposal. Instead of waging direct war against communism in the general public like before, they would enlist the general public to fight this war alongside them. The early tactics were criticized by many who didn't take such a hardline view of anti-communism, particularly among more liberal and libertarian politicians. A new campaign of educational materials was to be prepared to instruct Americans of the reactionary, intolerant, and bigoted nature of communism, repulsive even to moderates. And with the perceived prevalence of Catholicism in primarily immigrant and immigrant-descended working-class communities, the church was seen as the perfect candidate to lead this campaign. In 1947, the Catechetical Guild Educational Society of St. Paul published the comic book Is This Tomorrow? America Under Communism. The guild was dedicated to the education of Catholic youth through comics telling stories of religious history and scripture. In this comic, however, they warn of the looming threat of communism through a hypothetical accounting of a communist takeover in the U.S. By combining the classic tactics and rhetoric of communist infiltration and criminal conspiracy with repurposed anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant rhetoric of dual loyalties and un-American values, all presented under the guise of Catholic education, the Catechetical Guild synthesized the new standard for political debate. The front cover is a good example of this, invoking old fears of criminal violence. But as we read the first page, we can already see what sets this apart from the propaganda of the first Red Scare. To make you think, it proclaims. A label at the bottom of the page informs the reader that this book has been provided as a public service by the Catechetical Guild. Immediately, the reader is given the impression that they are reading an educational document from a legitimate source. Right away, we are shown the new rhetorical tactics of anti-communism. It goes on to inform us that, despite the small size of the Communist Party, many more have infiltrated society on behalf of the Kremlin. Communists themselves claim that for every party member, there are 10 others ready and willing to do the party's work. Before the invention of the internet, the average reader would not know that this is in fact a direct quote from J. Edgar Hoover in his testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and not a claim from any known communist organization. But it's the warning at the bottom of the page that sets the tone for the Cold War. Today, they are dead. We're living in communist slavery. It must not happen here. In the first Red Scare, the goal of communists and propaganda was criminal conspiracy and an armed uprising against the United States, bringing with them Bolshevik immorality and free love. Now, the communists were an advanced conspiracy seeking world domination and enslavement. The story begins shortly after World War II, giving us a sense of urgency without the fatigue of constant warnings of May Day uprisings that never came to pass. We are then given a glance into the high leadership of this fictitious Communist Party, as they plan their takeover with their Kremlin handlers. The leaders of the party appear to be drawn to invoke the image of Leon Trotsky, Adolf Hitler, and Joseph Goebbels. As the narrative progresses, they borrow mainly from fascist and Nazi tactics, with occasional communist labor rhetoric. They explain how they've already infiltrated the press and labor unions, with trained party members in control of both. They've established liberal anti-fascist front groups to gain endorsements from legislators, including the Speaker of the House, who effectively becomes their puppet. Now they claim that they have fostered ethnic and religious conflict, showing us a scene of their communist organizers spreading anti-Semitism among workers at a meeting. This is an important rhetorical tactic that was developed, as it allowed propagandists to blame communists for the already existing racial and social disharmony in the United States at the time. Even the front cover, with the subtitle America Under Communism, displays a fiery scene of racial violence, sexist violence, and police brutality. Are the authors really pretending that these did not occur in the United States? Of course not, but the reader is meant to subconsciously associate this fearful image with communist ideology, as opposed to directly engaging with it. This also allows propagandists to deflect criticisms of systemic discrimination in the U.S. by pointing to an invented cause. As our communist characters prepare to touch off a real crisis, as they say, they continue to exacerbate this racial and religious conflict, and along with starting widespread labor strikes. Communists played workers and farmers against each other, labor against capital. Lynching became common. In other places, the Red Plan was white against black. As general strike wages on, the president and vice president are assassinated in a bombing, allowing the communist-controlled speaker to take office with emergency powers. And here we see another significant tactic they use. The introduction instructed us to think. But all I can think right now is, how are they uniting labor against capital while pitting white against black? Lynching becomes widespread because of the communists. But at the time this was published, lynching was still unfortunately a common practice in the Deep South, even as the practice was in its decline. But because this is presented as an educational work by the Catechetical Guild, the reader isn't being asked to think about the validity or the realism of what is written. That's a given. The reader is instead meant to think about what this scenario would look like and how it would affect their personal life. The reader is meant to accept this narrative of communism as truth without question. Back to the book. The communists are in power now, ready to enact their policies. To scapegoat the anti-communists, they carry out a Reichstag fire-style false flag attack on the nation's food reserves, blowing up the storehouses. The communist leadership now takes direct control of the executive branch, and communists of all sorts, be they judges, teachers, or priests, are arrested in droves. Next, they secure control of the army, executing its leadership and replacing them with their own. And as the press continues to criticize the growing tyranny in the government, the party seizes control of all media distribution. But wait, you ask, didn't they already put party members in control of the press? Same with the army, right? And now the union leaders won't end their strike willingly? Didn't the communists start the strike? Aren't the union leaders already party members? And how is the general strike still going on? It's a simple trick, but the inconsistent timeline allows the propagandists to blame communists for both the infiltration and initiation of these protests and the harsh repression of these protests by the government. They infiltrated the media to make the reader unable to fully trust their news. Then they threaten the press and take complete control, teaching the reader that opposition will be silenced. And as the communists continue to take control over public life, the illustrators cleverly change the uniforms of the police and law enforcement from a familiar blue to a more militant Nazi-style gray. There are other scenes throughout the book meant to invoke the tactics of Nazis: concentration camps, beatings, forced work. And as the story closes and Chairman Jones is assassinated and succeeded by his own inner circle, we are given a final warning. The reader is taught not just to fear communism due to the events in the narrative. The reader is also taught to fear communists themselves. You are the one with whom the communist is struggling right now. This final message also serves as a new manifesto of anti-communism. No one can refuse to believe what he knows to be true, and we do know that every method shown in this presentation has been used by the communists in their rise to power in other countries. No sources need be presented for these claims, because this is the source. Thus, anti-communism could be divorced from real-life analysis, as it has now been turned into a religious belief and a religious struggle. Communism was no longer merely an anti-capitalist ideology to be debated on its merits, but rather an insidious force of evil, bringing murder, starvation, and slavery. We are warned that communists lay in wait to take advantage of crisis, and that only by resisting communism and knowing all about the invader can we preserve our freedom. This line would become the new standard for political debate, and would play a major role in supporting the state repression of communist activities. These same invented tactics would be used as undeniable proof by people like Joseph McCarthy that there was an ongoing communist infiltration of the government. His downfall, ironically, only came as a result of outrage at his targeting of the armed forces, which, like the comic, he accused of having been infiltrated. The comic portrays the infiltration of press outlets, Hollywood, and education. The same year this book was published, the infamous Hollywood 10 hearings before the HUAC, in which filmmakers were effectively blackballed from the industry due to accusations of communist ties, began. Teachers across the country would become subject to scrutiny, and many teachers, even to this day, must sign the classic loyalty statement, "I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of the Communist Party." The lasting effects of the propaganda campaign of the Red Scare and the tactics of its rhetoric are easy to see today. Just by looking at the response to the coronavirus in the United States, we can see the same tactics and the same patterns at play. The threat of infiltration with the China virus, projection and deflection of our own failings by blaming China for a cover-up, and whistleblower accusations, even as evidence emerges of our own attempts to silence COVID whistleblowers. Unquestionable truths, presenting China and other socialist states as inherently dishonest and untrustworthy. Mike Pompeo claims without evidence that the virus must have come from a Chinese lab. And the inconsistent timeline between Trump's initial downplaying of the virus and comparisons to the flu, predictions that it would go away in April. Now suddenly it's China's fault for not warning us, a stark turnaround from his previous support for China's efforts. And the resulting economic crisis and unemployment? Well, obviously, this is a lab-created communist plot to destroy the U.S. economy, just like the book told me. Never mind the U.S.'s continued imperialist incursions, even during pandemic, China's medical aid to other countries must have insidious motives, clearly. The Red Scare ended almost 30 years ago now, but we can clearly see how the rhetoric and patterns of propaganda have continued today. When Democrats want tax reforms, Republicans warn of a communist takeover. When Donald Trump has potentially shady ties to Russia, Democrats compare him to a KGB communist infiltrator. What would a propaganda organization like the Catechetical Guild look like today? An organization promoting religious and political propaganda, using short-form, easy-to-digest content devoid of any sources or factual explanations, relying on a formula of tactics, presenting opinion as fact, all while hiding behind a veneer of legitimate education. Prager and others like them have effectively brought these tactics into the modern day, likely a response to the growing popularity of socialism among youth. Like propagandists before them, Prager makes no attempt to make an actual critique based on ideology, but instead to perpetuate a religious form of anti-communism, mirroring much of the old Red Scare rhetoric. And they aren't alone in this. Liberal media, conservative media, Democrats, Republicans, they all rely on the same tactics of anti-communism. When I started my research for this video, my goal was to compare the absurd propagandistic predictions of life under communism to the actual history of the United States. After all, this comic predicted the use of concentration camps against disloyal Americans, when just 1 year prior, over 100,000 Japanese and Japanese American citizens were interned in detention camps across the country. I was also inspired by this poster predicting factory closures and mass unemployment as a result of communism. Like many people right now, I am currently out of work, and I'm still unsure if and when my job will be able to reopen. Even before the pandemic crisis, we've seen massive job loss as a result of economic recession. But it was the history of this propaganda that became the focus of my attention, because of just how similar it is to modern-day political discussion. Right-wing networks like PragerU and Turning Point have encouraged a resurgence of this rhetoric among youth and students. The more we understand this history, the better we can combat its lasting effects. This video is mainly a focus on the specific tactics of the Cold War and Red Scare propaganda, but if you want a more in-depth look at how the state enforced anti-communism during this time, I'll leave some resources down in the description. I also recommend this book that helped me a lot in my research, Manufacturing Hysteria by Jay Feldman. It's a pretty detailed history of state tactics of surveillance and repression in defense of the American capitalist system. The only critique I have is the author's a bit optimistic conclusion, which seems to imply that these actions are the results of bad faith actors taking advantage of the system, rather than the expected result of the state's defense of capital. But when it comes down to the actual facts and history, it serves as a very well-written account of state repression and violence in modern times, especially as our government constantly accuses others of these very same acts. Thank you for joining me today, comrades. I hope you enjoyed this brief dive into history. I have some new projects I'm working on that I think you'll enjoy, so please stay tuned for more.